hopefully you've run into a little shocker about the Sumerians. Now, the civilization appears to have appeared suddenly in full bloom and full blown. Boom! Overnight, there they are. Where did they come from? My second graduate paper was on where they came from. I did that paper 43 years ago. To this day, we don't know. What do I think? I'll get before I'm through with it. I'll have told you that. Well, essentially, I think they came from some mountains nearby, like they said. Came down and settled in there. Now, folk, they did not pick the best place on earth to settle. The land they settled is a land where nothing grows except for clay. It is very difficult for farming. The climate is somewhat harsh. It hardly has any trees. But it is located next to a river. Now, all these civilizations, all these cities tended to locate next to rivers. The reason should be obvious. The river, of course, gave them water they needed for drinking, for bathing, and for their crops. But it was not this land of Sumer was not a good land to settle. And it seemed like it was there that all of a sudden a bunch of people advanced above everybody else living at the time. And whoosh, bang, there they are, full blown, fully settled. Now, in my day, the scholars tried to, I can quote my major professor, Dan Bain. They keep pushing this back. In other words, they tried to push back the time period they're trying to make it look like they were older than they were. Today, we have to admit, they don't appear that old. They appear fairly recent. No more than 4,000 years old, the oldest. It's difficult to make them any older than that. And in fact, it's difficult to historically prove that anybody existed before that time. It's like whoosh, all of a sudden. Now, all right. We're going to digress from the Sumerians for a while. Hey, believe me, I'll get back to them. Get back to your standard history. Now, here's basically what standard history tells us about man's origins. That over time, man progressed with a group of primates, broke off from other primates, and folk, they changed which primate it was. Now, when I was at one time it was the monkey, then it became the gorilla. Lately, it's been the chimpanzee, but even more recently, some people say that due to DNA studies, it became the lemur. Which primate man broke off from, again, that's a big issue. But eventually, you take a path that leads us up to modern man. The first humans, you start off, they were supposedly very primitive and hunter-gatherers. First humans we call, now this is in the book, and for those of you following along in the book, I'm looking at page 5. Ancient man was called Paleolithic. That means Old Stone Age. Go for the Old Stone Age. Then, of course, you have Mesolithic. Don't worry about that. Then you've had the newer Stone Age, Neolithic. Supposedly it's called the Stone Age because these people were primitive and they only knew how to make things out of stone. And they shaped their stones into bow heads and arrowheads and spearheads and knives, cutters. They were what we call hunter-gatherers. That is, they went out and hunted for their game and gathered their food from where they could find it. They learned which roots were edible, which berries were edible, how to distinguish a mushroom from a toadstool, and eventually civilized enough to learn how to plant crops and domesticate animals. They eventually learned that certain types of animals were easier to domesticate than others, and they eventually became civilized. Now, some of the bones that we found, I mean, start off with the Neanderthal man. Sometimes you put an H here, sometimes you don't. The most recent, the Cro-Magnon man, he looks very much like a modern man. Now, several years ago, I had a DNA study, and I'm tempted to do it again. I mean, I had to spend $100, and they gave me a genotype of R1b. The Cro-Magnon man has the same genotype. All right, what I want you to know about these men, though, the Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man, their average height was 6 feet for both of them. And their average brain capacity was noticeably larger than that of modern humans. Now, we know that the modern humans are descended from the Cro-Magnon man. A big question is the Neanderthal man a cousin, or is he an ancestor? Did modern humans intermarry with Neanderthals? My personal view is yes, they did. And that we could reconstruct a Neanderthal person if we could find a male, a member of one sex that had a bunch of Neanderthal genes, and make that person a member of the opposite sex that had the same, and then keep on crossbreeding until we could eventually restore the Neanderthal man. Now, he's pictured as a primitive caveman, and some people wonder if he could even talk. He buried his dead, and he buried his dead with flowers, indicating he had religion. What they won't tell you a lot of times is oftentimes he is buried right next to modern humans, indicating that they intermingled with each other, intermarried, and basically were the same species. Again, this is something I'm throwing at you, but this is one of the controversies. Now, your book shows a picture of some cave paintings in a cave in France. There are a lot of caves in France that have paintings. The paintings use a high quality oil that has lasted for perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 years. Now, your book calls them Paleolithic. In other words, they're the very, very older people. Now, I want to say this about cave people. It's documented. Every generation of mankind has had cave people. We have people living in caves today who own iPads or cell phones and have electricity pumped into their caves. What am I getting at? These caves are high quality paintings using high quality oils, which indicates to me, if you see a cave person, a caveman carrying around an iPad, you can pretty well guess he lives on the fringe. All right, we have out here in Atlanta, we have bridge people who live under bridges, and some of them own sophisticated radios and cell phones. When you see a person living in a cave who has something like a cell phone, you can assume he's on the fringe of a much more advanced society. To me, the people who made these paintings were living on the fringes of a much more advanced society. All right, anybody want to comment? Hey, I'm about to throw at you some controversial stuff that hopefully is going to be thought-provoking. All right, how primitive were these people? All of you have heard of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. How many of you have heard that we don't have the technology to build one if we tried? I've got some people to look up at me. Have any of you heard that we couldn't build one? They moved 60-ton stones and raised them up 400 feet likely without a causeway. In Peru, Cuzco, a place called Cuzco, there is some stone structures, 13,000 feet. Now, the stone was quarried at sea level, and the cliffs rise straight up from sea to 13,000 feet. How did they get those stones? At 13,000 feet, folks, you cannot breathe unless you go up slowly. In other words, if you went from sea level to 13,000 feet, you died quickly. How did they raise those stones from sea level to 13,000 feet? Now, I'll tell you something. We can't do it. Last time I taught this course, one of the girls asked me, do you have a rational explanation for how the pyramids were built? I said, I have none. What I'm getting at, folks, is these people were not primitive. I'm going to be talking more about this, particularly when it comes to the Vedas. Vedas is the ancient Indian sacred writings. The Vedas depict and actually show outlines and how to put together airplanes. But airplanes that could do things that none of ours can do. Airplanes that could fly above the ground and submerge underwater, then get back up and fly in the air again. We don't have a device that can do that. They did. Space travel. Okay, the people living at the time, the Vedas said that they did it. Atomic weapons.